Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. On a cold Rochester afternoon, we want to welcome you to this space to share some really important and vital information with you on behalf of TEDx Rochester. My name is Kwesi Boetti. I'm the co-executive of TEDx Rochester. We want to welcome you to this space to really invite you to be thoughtful and intentional about the words that you hear, um, and be open to the opportunities for growth and the idea that is worth spreading. And I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Kevin.
Thank you, Kwasi. Good evening. I'm Kevin Beckford, the co-chair of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to be partnering with TEDx Rochester to bring you tonight's program, which grew out of the overwhelming positive response we received to the workshops led by Simeon Bannister and Shane Wiggin in our Summit to End Hate this September. The mission of the Levine Center to End Hate is to unite the greater Rochester community in overcoming hate through education, dialogue, and ultimately to positive action. We offer programming that inspires participants to challenge their assumptions and acquire new knowledge, engage in active and courageous conversations, and to take action to address hate. Tonight, we have over 1,000 people joining us on this call. That's over 1,000 people that are committed to learning about policies that have excluded African Americans, resulting in disparities in health, education, wealth, accumulation, and more. It is my sincere hope that you will leave tonight inspired to use your position, power, and agency to create meaningful change in your homes, your neighborhoods, your community, your workplace, and ultimately our world. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce to you Simeon Bannister, the Vice President of Community Programs at the Rochester Area Community Foundation, and Shane Wiggin, co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at Pastone, and fourth grade teacher in Russian Reader School. Thank you.
Well, it is absolutely my pleasure to be with you this evening and to share this space. Let me just say quickly that Shane and I have been doing a version of this presentation, his about an hour, mine about an hour. And we've been called on to condense this down to 45 minutes. So we are gonna move quickly tonight. We recognize that the pace might be a little bit difficult to follow, but do rest assured that we are offering the video for your review later. And then we'll also be making some sessions available for you to engage with us in the future. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And one way to do that is to start with some context. This wonderful town of Rochester that we all live in has a major disparity challenge. Racialized economic insecurity is geographically distributed. We're gonna break that apart. First, let's talk about racialized economic insecurity. This is a report, the Hard Facts Report, originally published by Act Rochester Initiative of Rochester Area Community Foundation back in 2017, updated last summer. And in this update, what we see on these charts are the clearly different racialized economic insecurity when we look at the childhood poverty rate, which, as we know in Rochester, is amongst the highest in the country. When we think about median household income, when we think about the poverty rate overall, and when we think about home ownership, these disparities continue to show up time after time. And what these charts show us is that for almost any given measure, white Rochesterians are richer, own homes, and more economically stable, almost double that of Rochesterians that are African American or Latino. So we have a racialized economic insecurity challenge. But it's also that we've got a concentrated poverty challenge because that racialized economic insecurity is geographically distributed. When we look, for example, at just one quick measure, and there are many others, we look at the mean income. Rochester, in the city of Rochester, the mean income is $55,806. Monroe County's is $84,666. Already you should be thinking to yourself, bing, there goes a disparity. And Brighton at $97,829. And even on the south and west side of town, we still see those same persistent disparities. So it's not just that economic insecurity is racialized, but we also know that it's geographically distributed. And if you said to me, Simeon, how do you know that? I think all of us know viscerally deep down in our bones. And if we just hop in our cars and drive around the community, we all know the parts of town that have the economic challenges. In fact, it's become so ingrained that it's colloquially known as the crescent. And we know the parts that do not. So why does all this matter? Well, this matters because economic distress is not just a symptom. Economic distress is a root cause. Follow me. I heard a wonderful author, Richard Rothstein. We'll hear about him briefly in a part of the presentation a little bit later. But Richard, answering a caller that reached out when he and I shared some space at Evan Dawson's Connection show, pointed out that when you have a community where you have no jobs, that it's not long that you get illicit activity because people have to do something to get by. And when you're doing something to get by, maybe you have improvised families. Maybe somebody gets pregnant. And in those improvised families, because of the compression of time and choice that poverty brings upon folks, maybe child support doesn't get paid. Maybe folks get criminally justice involved. Maybe because you're criminally justice involved, you can't then find a job. What we realize is that some of what we see is not just malignant behavior, but instead it is a function of the environment that folks find themselves in, the circumstances. Economic distress matters. Economic distress is a root cause. So when we take a step back and we think about this on a regional basis, we know where the economic distress is. We know who the economic distress affects. So the fundamental question that we have to start asking ourselves is not just charging in to try to solve the problem. We've got to ask, how did we get here? How did all this happen? And that's the spirit of this presentation tonight, to give you some reference points in terms of how we got here, and then get a sense of what we might do moving forward. So let's talk a bit about how we got here. Rochester, New York. Rochester was a Western boom front town. We know that in the late 1820s, the Erie Canal was completed. Rochester was before then had been kind of the boondocks, if you will, a place to send grain back to the bustling metropolitan areas of the East Coast, places like New York City and Boston. And that's how we got this moniker of being the flower city. Well, in this boom front town, when the canal was completed, all of a sudden this place started to grow. It was also a point of departure for people that were going out west to make their fortunes. And we know that Nathaniel Rochester's children and many of the other city mothers and fathers stopped here and then kept right on going out west to make their fortunes and to try their hand, some at prospecting, others in other ways. But eventually people started to settle here in this place. And what we start to see is rapid population growth in the late 19th century. So that by the time Rochester is established as a city in 1834, the population about 16,000 folks. By 1900, in just 70 years, the population has swelled to almost 160,000 people. And that growth continues all the way to 1950, where it reaches a zenith at 332,000 people in the city of Rochester. At the same time, we see economic growth, that often those labs, folks are tinkering and coming up with the new solutions, ways to manipulate light in particular. And of course, from that grows Eastman Kodak and the juggernaut of Xerox and Bausch and Lomb. That economic growth, which occurs in the early part of the 20th century, catapults Rochester really to the forefront of American cities. It's out of this town that you start to see the kind of job base that in some ways is dissimilar from places with whom we are often compared. So for example, there's a statistic that we came across that in Rochester in 1965, about 60% of manufacturing jobs were instrument-based manufacturing. That would be the equivalent of what we call advanced manufacturing today. And that really matters because it means that we were not a place that had a lot of field to factory floor kinds of opportunities. And that had far-reaching implications for who would ultimately come here. I want you to take that little factoid and stick it in your back pocket. We're going to revisit that in a moment. The comparable situation would be something like if you showed up in Mountain View or Cupertino right now, and you said, hey, I'm looking for a job. And they'd say, well, can you write software? Do you have a special skill that you bring to the table? And perhaps if not, then there would be a little bit more difficulty to sustain yourself and what we now know as Silicon Valley. Rochester in some ways was Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley. So then that also begs the question, so what about people of color in Rochester? Well, hopefully there's a lot of people on this call. And so I'm hoping that a subset of you are at least familiar with the Great Migration. If you don't know, that's a period from about 1920 to 1970, where you have massive population movement, arguably the single largest level of population movement in this country's history. 6 million African-American folks that leave the agrarian South, moving to industrial cities. And in some cases, folks pick up and move, and other folks, they're fleeing some of the terror of the South. In other cases, they are wooed to come north by corporations and companies that literally send buses down south and say, come on up north. And we know that there are cultural productions that come from that moment as well. Cultural productions like the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, we can familiarize ourselves with the stylings, the music, and the culture that come from the Harlem Renaissance. But right here in our little old town in Rochester, we have to ask, what was Rochester's non-white population in 1950? And I will tell you that when our population was at the highest, 332,000 people, only 2% of them were people of color. And just as a reference point, today, the population is about 62% in the city of Rochester non-white. 2%, about 7,800 people. In 1960, the population in Rochester starts to decline, goes from 332,000 down to 318,000. And the non-white population starts to increase from 7,800 to 24,000. In 1970, again, population decline to 296,000 people overall. Population of the non-white people in Rochester increases again to 52,000, so that we end up with a very clear trend line. The overall population declines, the white population is declining, but the non-white population is increasing. And that statistic, that trend line has continued through the 2010 census. I am very eager to see what the 2020 census shows us, because the 2017 ACS American Community Survey was the first time in generations that we saw the initial reverse of that trend line. This is a really big deal, because we have to beg the question of shared prosperity. During Rochester's greatest period of economic growth, I told you to keep that card in your back pocket, take it out and put it on the table. When you have massive economic growth, its non-white population is either absent, on the periphery, or excluded. You'll have to excuse me because of time, but I'll just say anecdotally that from an absent perspective, people were still coming to this community. On the periphery is a nod to the fact that when people came to our region, they ultimately came often as agricultural workers. And as agricultural workers, they occupied the farms in places like Medina. My family came to Mumford, New York, places like Sodus. And then finally excluded, George Eastman, he who is regaled as, in many ways, the very paternalistic father of Rochester, who believed in scientific governance, who supported many HBCUs, also proclaimed that African Americans would not be welcome to work in Kodak factories. And that's really important, folks, because when the guy in charge says it, it gives cover to a lot of other people to take those same practices. By the time African Americans initially, and then Latino Americans, and then later folks that are coming from Central America started to come into this community, the party was over. Xerox was on the decline. Kodak was on the decline. And at the same time, populations were increasing. There was not concomitant growth in resources. The seeds were sown for economic distress. This is in part the reality of our community. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready to face it? And with that, I pass the baton over to my friend, Shane Wiegand. Shane, take it away.
Thank you so much, Simeon, for that incredible presentation. And what I want to talk about is to face something directly that we haven't often faced in our community, something else that was going on in the way that our city fathers designed Rochester to be a place of prosperity for some and not others. And I want to challenge us to live out this quote from the great James Baldwin, who writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I hope you'll join me in taking a look and facing the way people of color always have in our community, some of the root causes of disparity and systemic racism in our community. Let's begin with the great Howard Coles, editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper on Clarissa Street in the 3rd Ward. In 1938, he and his paper directly confronted redlining and racial segregation at the federal, state, and local level. Doing a massive study of housing, they found that African Americans were forced in Rochester by banks, real estate agents, and the government to live in just 2 small neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th wards. In those neighborhoods, over 30% of units did not have running water, and yet the city and county chose to do nothing. The great Dr. Anthony Jordan built on Howard Coles' research, connecting health equity to housing, finding a direct connection between housing and health, where Black death rates from all causes were 50% higher than that of whites. And when it came to tuberculosis, the death rate for people of color was 2.5 times that of whites. Think about today, where people of color are dying from COVID-19 at 3 times the rate. The Reverend Body at Mount Olivet, almost 10 years later, continued to speak out, this time in the Democrat and Chronicle, calling the situation for what it was and urging change, saying the housing situation has always been an enigma to people of color. In Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available for him, and if any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And tonight, I want to take a look at the opposition specifically from the federal, state, and local government, as well as the culture in our community towards people of color having access to home ownership and in turn wealth and prosperity. I want to begin though with the most critical piece, the New Deal's National Housing Act of 1934. It's in the wake of the Great Depression, and FDR of New York State signs into law this Housing Act that forever changes the face of our country, something that is responsible for building all of the suburbs here in Rochester through a massive federal subsidy when it came to mortgage insurance and home construction and highway construction, all of those kinds of key things that have created our community to this day. And built right into this policy, it's the FHA mortgage, the 30-year loan, the low fixed interest rate, eventually the VA mortgage. And there was also a clause into this law that it was exclusively for white folks only. Written into the underwriting manual, it said if a neighborhood is to retain stability, its necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes, going on to mandate that racial covenants be placed into any deeds that receive federal insurance or subsidies, prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. If communities like Rochester want to build highways, they need to make sure that those highways are separating inharmonious racial groups, which allows us to build 490 and the inner loop separating downtown from the predominantly Black 3rd and 7th wards. This policy did its main brunt of its enforcement through something called redlining. The FHA tasked the Homeowners Loan Corporation with training agents, real estate agents all across the country, including in Rochester, to go street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, and assessing properties to determine their security. And security for insurance and government investment and for who should live where was directly connected to race and class. Green and blue meant predominantly 100% white neighborhoods, predominantly middle to upper middle class. Yellow, older neighborhoods. White, but more maybe lower class folks. Red meant hazardous if even one person of color lived there, or if there were environmental issues like the vacuum oil plant in the Plymouth Exchange neighborhood. Now, let's take a look at the government report for Corn Hill, a neighborhood where today children are expected, who are born there today, are expected to live up to 9 years less than children in Pittsford, according to Common Ground Health. Take a look, 75% Black, 10% foreign, incredibly low income. Compare that to the report of Pittsford, 0% Black, 0% foreign, and quadruple the incomes of the folks in Corn Hill. And it wasn't just Pittsford, it was all across this community. Compare Meadowbrook's Brighton neighborhood, built by the Kodak Corporation and funded by ESL Bank, 0% Black. Look at Beechwood, 2% Black, my neighborhood, therefore hazardous. No federal investment, neighborhoods where people of color would be steered. Meanwhile, all of our little villages, which really weren't quite suburbs yet, they were too small at that time, were all green lined. And that green lining allowed thousands of people of my own family to be able to buy homes thanks to this federal investment. To give you some idea of the scale of this, in 1960, the DNC reported there were only 11 individual people of color living in Henrietta, which was the most integrated suburb of Rochester, led by Dr. Cooper and his wife, and several other people of color at the NAACP that decided to move into town in solidarity, not because they wanted to live there, but because there was nowhere else to go. Richard Rothstein of The Color of Law writes, the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide during this period of time, and the majority of private mortgages followed these same racist policies laid out by the government. The FHA and VA giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance, federal subsidies for handouts to families like mine. This also wasn't just limited to homeownership, but to public housing, exclusively for white folks, like Alfred Gertis, our FHA guy here in Rochester, breaking down in Brighton Manor, all-white veterans complex for veterans with children. Howard Coles at The Voice tried to get Black veterans that qualified in, but all of them were denied because of the color of their skin. Rothstein goes on to say that over 35 million families benefited from these loans. 98% of them were white. Meanwhile, the real estate industry, which helped create this federal policy, which codified what they were already doing, had written into their code of ethics, something that real estate agents in Rochester could lose their license if they didn't follow, this statement, that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property, occupancy, or members of any race, nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in this neighborhood. Frank Drum was our head of the real estate board at the time, and he did enforce this. We know because Howard Coles, who again you met earlier, got his real estate license to fight this racist policy. And quickly after showing Black folks homes in white neighborhoods like the 19th Ward, Drum and his friends at the real estate board forced him out of the real estate industry. Meet Dr. Alice Holloway Young, who later went on to be the first Black principal in the RCSD and across the county, a founder of Monroe Community College, the urban suburban program. She and her husband James were an upper middle class family, and they tried to buy a house in the 19th Ward. But not a single real estate agent would show them a home, even though there were several available. And not a single bank would pre-approve them a mortgage because of the color of their skin. So they did what the 57 other people of color did at the time. They found a wealthy white person, usually at the NAACP. She found her friend Harper Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph fortune to buy them a house sight unseen on Millbank Street in the 19th Ward, and then lied on the paperwork, said Alice was her niece, and deeded it over to her through a private mortgage. The Youngs moved in the middle of the night, fearing the racial terror from the Ku Klux Klan in that neighborhood. And sure enough, the next morning, Dr. Young talks about finding a note in their mailbox from the Ku Klux Klan. It's horrific and I won't read, but that did threaten to burn their house down if they didn't leave. Dr. Young is a friend, and when we've talked, she's asked that when I share her story, I mention that the Bush family that lived down their street was the only white family that stood up and stood with the Youngs and helped them live there for the next 17 years. And the next time you hear someone say, those were just the times, things were different back then, remember that Bush family. We don't think about the Ku Klux Klan as something from Rochester, and yet it was an institution. Look at what is East Rochester's now high school football field, where over 8,000 fully robed Rochester Klansmen were gathered, burning 3 50-foot high crosses in celebration of white supremacy and terror. The next area of racism I want to discuss that shaped our community is something called racially restrictive covenants. Now, when you buy a house, anyone who owns a home has a deed that has rules or covenants that are legally enforceable for how you have to use their home. Now, one of the most popular covenants or rules was something that explicitly said that these dwellings shall never be occupied by people not of the Caucasian race. And this was something that happened from the top of Rochester's elite all the way to the bottom, and thousands of them are put on homes across our community. This summer, my students and I, my friends at City Roots Land Trust and the Yale Law School came together to publish a massive report documenting some of the scope and what we can do about these covenants, finding that County Manager Clarence Smith and the county legislature voted and signed off on putting these racial covenants in 1939 and 40 on hundreds of homes that were tax foreclosed properties, trying to secure them by making it say on every deed, no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall occupy any building or lot. Kodak got involved as well. George Eastman and Harry Haight, they helped found the Kodak Realty Corporation, which bought a plot of land with 371 lots. ESL Bank was founded to finance these homes. And in every one of these homes, Kodak made sure that this covenant saying no person of color could ever live there would be enforced. Simeon talked about Kodak and how people of color didn't have access. And if you take a look, they were actually written up by a New York State Commission in 1939, where of their 16,000 employees, they had one Black janitor, whereas Bausch and Lomb had 0 Black employees at this time. This was a part of the white supremacist culture in our community. Take a look at the Catholic Church. Bishop John Francis O'Hearn agreeing to these racist covenants on churches like St. James Church in Irondequoit. School districts like the school board at Thomas Edison and Gates proudly put this right on their school, barring Black students from ever attending or using their buildings. Pittsburgh, all along the homes by Oak Hill and East Avenue Estates, thousands of homes proudly advertised in the DNC by Grafton Johnson in Northwest Irondequoit, one of which was agreed to by the founder of Wegmans, Walter E. Wegman, who didn't have to keep it on his home when he went to sell it, but made sure that that covenant stayed on for the next person who bought it. Of course, places all across the community like Webster, notice sometimes Polish, Italian, and Jewish folks were discriminated against. Look at Penfield, all throughout Greece. The head of the Builders Association, Norman Huck and Gates, and Frank Drum of the Rochester Realtors Association, putting hundreds of those on their homes and gates. The head of the Rochester Bar, Early of Case, doing the same, all throughout the city of Rochester, including the 19th Ward. And as we know, just like Howard Coles, people of color in Rochester have always faced head-on the racism in our community and tried to do something about it. Judge Davis, who later became the first Black judge in Rochester, tried to buy a house in the 19th Ward and described his situation like this, saying, "My wife and I were looking for a house in 1958. Saw a house we liked in 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester, a block or so west of Genesee," one of those red lines. I'd say there were probably 4 Black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee at that time. The owner refused to sell to us because we were Black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. A quick note about Italians, Jewish, and Eastern European folks. In 1944, with the GI Bill, the federal government officially recognized those folks as now white and worthy of not having to deal with these covenants, and also they could have the full rights to home ownership through FHA and VA loans if they had returned from World War II, whereas Black World War II veterans did not have that same access to home ownership. Davis describes how he fought this, saying, "I was active in the NAACP at the time, and a white friend bought the house and transferred it to me. We had to go through those kinds of devious methods in order to find housing." He describes the situation as typical of the time and the segregation he describes throughout our suburban community as pretty locked down. In our report, we found these are some of the first 10 or 15,000 covenants across our community. We expect to find another 10 to 20 as researchers at U of R and RIT continue to dig deep into the county clerk's archives. So the next thing we've got to ask, and I know some of you must be wondering, well, in Rochester, our reputation is this activist community of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony that fought back against these kind of things. This must have been something the federal government did to us, not something that really people wanted in Rochester, or maybe it was just, something that was happening. Well, something that gives us some important context to the welcome and desire for this racial segregation in Rochester is something called a blackface minstrel show that happened at almost every school district, Catholic and Protestant church, and town hall and clubs all across our community every year from the early 1900s to the late 1960s, called a blackface minstrel show. Every show followed the same pattern. You'd have a group of adults or kids dressed in blackface with burnt cork and garishly painted on red lips, with the main characters called N-men, a Jim Crow, a Jim C-O-O-N, a Jim Dandy character, a Mr. Bones, and sometimes a Black Sambo character who would mock and sing and mock the intelligence of people of color, sending a message of hate and contempt and a clear statement of welcome for white supremacist policy in our community. Take a look at Kodak. They had their annual show and proudly published it right in their Kodak magazine. The Jewish Young Men's Association at the Lyndhurst Theater having their annual blackface show. Pittsburgh's Town Hall partnered with the Catholic Church and Masons to have the annual blackface show in Pittsburgh. Take a look at RCSD, where almost every school had one of these shows. Aquinas, Brighton High School's Licorice Lights performance, Allendale Private School, in partnership with U of R, would put these shows on at the Memorial Art Gallery and their school's stage. You can see it at RIT and all across our community, these shows happening annually and proudly written up and advertised in the Democrat and Chronicle as something to be proud of in our community and a clear statement of who really met the standards for what it meant to be a citizen of our community. Of course, people of color fought back. The Reverend Primo at the NAACP spoke out in the DNC, writing, "These shows must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, and buildings. To do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community accepted shows towards all of the dark-skinned people of the world." Just imagine the legacy of the thousands and thousands of kids that attended these shows and learned these messages of hate in the 1960s who are still alive today. As activists of color continued to fight back, Governor Harriman, instead of action, offered a commission, as often happens. And in this commission in 1958, while not super helpful for folks at the time, offers us some really great insight into how these racist policies directly impacted the African-American community in Rochester, finding that African-Americans, over 80%, were forced into those 3rd and 7th Ward Redline neighborhoods. In those two neighborhoods, over 1,600 units had no bath or a shared bath, and in over 2,000, more than one person was living in each room. Connie Mitchell, the first person of color to be elected to public office in Monroe County, she ran in part against things like redlining, describing why she ran, saying we were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house in Gregg Street, the real estate agent told us, "I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're not open to Black people." The report goes on to find that over 30% of all units in these two neighborhoods had no running water, something Coles had called out 20 years prior, and yet no one in our community in power thought to do anything about it. Meanwhile, not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any Black person in our community in any suburb, at least until 1958, according to the report. Only 57 Black families were able to own a home outside of these two neighborhoods, like the Wells, who joined the Coopers in Henrietta, or folks like Dr. Thomas and Ermina Bias, whose story is a really common story for people who had more means and tried to move into these neighborhoods. The Biases bought a home in 1960 in West Irondequoit. They had bricks thrown through their living room window, threats of death if they didn't leave their home. They sold their home and tried to buy a house in Henrietta, joining the Coopers and Lees and Wells. Unfortunately, because of their skin color, the developer wouldn't sell them a home. So they had to sue and take it all the way to the state court for the right to live in their home on Gatehouse Trail. The Tullivers in Brighton, their entire neighborhood pooled money together to try to buy the house out from under them, forcing the Tullivers to sue for the right to live in their home. Ellen Stubbs also had to sue for the right to live in her home in Greece, bringing a white person with her to go separately and play this game of checkers of, is there any homes available for me? Oh, absolutely, white person. For Ellen, no homes available. They used that data and they sued, and she won the right to move into Greece, integrating it in 1963. Meanwhile, builders like Norman Huck, Fred Ha-Tosh, Frank Drum, all these other guys, Max Farish, were making hundreds of millions of dollars in the real estate industry. Money they could not have made if it hadn't been for this racist federal policy that allowed incredible subsidies to these builders to acquire incredible wealth, causing these towns to jump in population, like Pittsford, growing from 9,000 to over 25,000 residents, acknowledged by Pittsford's Barrow Architecture Report in 2017 as being directly related to these federal loans that allowed people to build and buy these homes. Meanwhile, in these redlined Black communities, the homes were falling apart because the white landlords couldn't get investments from banks and weren't taking care of the properties. Urban renewal happened, pushing hundreds and hundreds of families out of their homes to make way for the Inner Loop, 490, and the construction of businesses. All of this led people of color to have nowhere really to go. They couldn't go to the suburbs or Green Line neighborhoods of the city, so they were packed into the outer areas like Jefferson Avenue, where white families would take a single family home and pack it into 5 single family apartments in a single family home. This incredible overcrowding became the norm in these neighborhoods. And the city and county had a choice. We could decide to fund anti-racist policies. We could try to open up housing. We could rehab these homes for people, open things up, or we could fund policing. And that's what they chose to do, massively increasing the budgets for police departments, increasing the numbers of police, and enforcing a policy of containment to keep people of color in these same neighborhoods, much the same as our police are doing today. I'll remind you it was on Jefferson Avenue that Daniel Prude was killed in police custody, one of those same streets whose African-American population ballooned because of these racist policies in our community. The last thing I want to touch on is Brown versus Board of Education and the educational issues today in Rochester. Some of you may not know that the barrier or boundary between Rochester and the town of Penfield School District is the most segregated school district line in the entire United States, according to Ed Week in 2020. You can see this photograph right here of the Little Rock Nine, real famous Elizabeth Eckford in Arkansas, being racially harassed by an angry mob of white parents just for trying to attend school and being a person of color. But look over 10 years later, the scene of white parents harassing a group of Black students who are integrating Charlotte High School in 1971. The DNC reporting that the tensions developed at Charlotte yesterday after 3 Black girls were cut by flying glass on a bus that was stoned by white parents who eventually were successful in getting the city to scrap their integration plan the next year. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Simeon to talk about how has this left us and what can we do about it.
Shane, thank you so much. Poignant presentation. As I was listening to Shane, I heard my sort of think through some of the names that I was hearing Shane recount. And I'm sure that there were some names that were familiar to you. Alice Young is familiar to me. She helped bring my mom to Rochester, and her son, Rodney, graduated high school with my dad. Connie Mitchell, somebody that was a close family friend and someone that we knew and loved. Ellen Stubbs could always be counted on to give you a Pepsi from her trunk. The reason why I raise this is because this isn't ancient history. This happened in recent Rochester times. And there is a real cost for what we see. We think about the cost of inequity, and I'll share with you my own personal tale. On the left, what you see here are the honorable discharge papers from my grandfather. 1946 is when he made his way here to Rochester. Shane referenced those Black veterans that couldn't get access and couldn't get resources. Yeah, my grandfather was one of those. Because he had been in the Army, he worked for Pike Construction, had developed those skills, and he was a labor foreman that helped build some of the most prolific buildings in Rochester. However, many of the guys that he worked with, a lot of Italian guys in particular, could go and they could get those loans. In fact, there's a wonderful and very interesting book by a woman named Nell Irvin Painter called The History of White People. She calls this phenomena the enlargement of whiteness, that those Polish folks and those Italian folks and Jewish brothers and sisters that Shane referenced earlier all of a sudden became white. Didn't happen for my grandpa. And because he couldn't get those loans, despite the fact that I love what I do every day at the Community Foundation, I must confess that I wonder what it would have been like to be the scion of the Bannister construction dynasty. You see, this is a little different picture of inequity than what we're used to. Generally, when we have these conversations about inequity, what comes to mind are folks that are in the most economically challenged situations, and it should. But also know that up and down the income strata, the effects of this history are real. On the right-hand side is my dad. My dad died at 67 years old. That little fella that he's holding is my son, Julian, who when my dad died was only 3 years old. Parenthetically, I'll note that I was 2 years old when my grandfather died. My dad, when he was a kid, grew up in one of these redlined areas and had rheumatic fever. Didn't get the kind of health care that he needed. He was one of the few African-American managers at Xerox with all of the stress and the frustration. Remember all those blackface pictures that you saw? Yeah, that was the culture that continues to permeate through Rochester. Being an African-American in one of those few spaces, the toll that that takes on the body. And so that little fella doesn't get to spend time with his grandfather. He doesn't get to spend the social capital that his grandfather accrued in the same way that I didn't with mine. There is a cost to inequity. We saw the Homeowners Loan Corporation map earlier. And many of us are familiar with the crescent part of Rochester. And we know that story of economic disparity, but we also recognize that people that come from certain zip codes can expect to have years shaved off their life. It is time for us to do something. And lest you think that nothing's happening, certainly in government, we know that there are some things that are underway in the city, in the county, in the school district. We know that the RAISE Commission and Operation Transformation Rochester, that there was a focus from the school district and student attendance, and whatever the latest educational reform is that comes along. We know that collective impact has been a defining part of our community, that Rock the Future is actively working on education, that Connected Communities is looking to revitalize the Emma and Beechwood neighborhood, that our MAPI is trying to reduce poverty significantly. But we have to contend with the question, are these strategies working? Well, we know that we've seen some marginal gains in education. The graduation rate, for example, has increased, but we also know that in 2013, the testing regime changed, and we have to account for that. We've seen some minimal reductions in poverty, a 0.5% downtick in the poverty rate, but we also know that minimum wage was increased and that some of the largest gains were with the lowest decile of wage earners. And my goodness, haven't we seen over the last 10 months the racial disparities exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, showing the wide expanse in health outcomes? And I would even beg the question, as we look to vaccine distribution, who's getting the vaccine? Who's not getting the vaccine? And why? I have to wonder that for all the strategies that we've tried, for the collective impact and the commissions, we saw Shane's reference earlier to a commission. Is there something else at play? Is there something else beyond just systemic incoherence? Is there something else beyond just a need to integrate the system? Is there something else that's going on in this community that we have to wrestle with? I would just point you to the numbers. In the city of Rochester, a population of 200,000 earns income of about $4.6 billion. In Monroe County, a population of about 742,000, which by the way includes the city of Rochester, income is nearly $40 billion. The disparity jumps out at us. The Bureau of Labor and Economic Analysis calculates GDP down to the county level. They offer the metropolitan statistical area. That includes actually multiple counties. But we took a crack at calculating a GDP for the city of Rochester and came back with a number of about $5.2 billion of economic activity here in the city of Rochester. Per capita income, $22,509. In the county, per capita income, $52,951. The disparity is painfully evident. I would submit to you that what we see is a formula for failure. Let me give you a quick example of that. The police personnel budget is about $87 million. The fire budget is about $48 million. Just in personnel expenses, the Rochester City School District's personnel expense is about $560 million. And when you add all of that up, you get a shade under $700 million. We conservatively estimate, and trust me, it is conservative, that 70% of the folks that work just in these municipal services live outside of the city of Rochester. I know that it's conservative because the police department actually puts out its data, and we know that 94% of sworn police officers live outside of the city of Rochester. There is an interesting argument to be made about whether or not that affects the performance. Can you be a good cop or a good teacher or a good firefighter if you don't live with the people that you serve? A lot of people are having that argument, but you know what's indisputable? That those dollars leave the city of Rochester every year, about $500 million just in the municipal services. When we extrapolate that out, working with the Institute for Poverty Studies and Economic Development at SUNY Brockport, we got a number when you throw in the nonprofit sector. For those of you that are curious, about 80% of nonprofit expense is usually personnel costs. We know, again, that that personnel is largely suburban and white. We know that of the rest of that 100%, the other 20% that's going to pay things like rent and supplies, that the vendors are usually overwhelmingly suburban and white, that the building owner is usually suburban and white. We're not here to set up any antithetical or adversarial relationship, but we have to appreciate the way that dollars are flowing through this community, that functionally what we have set up in Rochester is an extractive economy, and that is the recipe. It is the literal definition for how you end up with concentrated poverty. We can't sustain a system that is losing those kinds of resources. Why? Because what it leads to is underdeveloped institutions. We referenced earlier that this phenomena of people of color in Rochester is a relatively new one. You think about a place like Buffalo, even, for example, with its blue collar jobs in that early part of the 20th century, they had their first council member in the city of Buffalo in 1950. That didn't happen in Rochester until 1975. We have underdeveloped institutions, and the strategies we keep using depend on these underdeveloped institutions. We need to figure out vaccine distribution. What will we do? I know, let's call the churches. Those are underdeveloped institutions. We have under-resourced interventions. I don't know if you listened to Mike Mazzeo talk after the horrific incident of this child of our community being pepper sprayed, but he said, hey, my cops might have to respond to 5 or 6 more of these cases in a single day. It's the one thing he said that I really believed. Why is that? Because we have under-resourced interventions. We don't have the resources that are necessary to respond to the challenges that exist in this community. And then on top of it, many of the responders themselves don't even live in the community. It is literally a race to the bottom in the city of Rochester. Add on top of that a little insult to injury that we pay a premium for constant failure, where the clearance rate for homicides in the city of Rochester is about 40%. You know what that means, friends? 60% chance that you can murder somebody in the city of Rochester and get away with it. Are we having a conversation about containment, about law enforcement, or are we talking about public safety? The overall clearance rate, 27%. You know what they are very good at catching? If you steal a loaf of bread from Walmart, you can count on the fact that you will likely get caught. Wrestle with that. Are we having a conversation about containment and law enforcement? By the way, I remind you that slavery was legal and that was enforced by the predecessors to many of our police departments. Or are we going to have a conversation in this community about public safety? Insult to injury. When we look at the way that the economy flows in this community, we are subsidizing quality of life for the suburbs. And guess what? Lest you think, hey, listen, I live in Brighton. I don't have it too bad. It's all good for me. We all suffer for it. Simeon, what do you mean by we all suffer for it? Well, see, the economy works kind of like the body. It's about the flow of resources. And we all know that just like in your body, when you get a blockage and resources start to aggregate, like blood starts to pool, that leads to death in other parts of the body. When I look at what happened with this young lady or the murder of Daniel Prude, when I look at the fact that RCSD suffers the most when we look at state funding cuts, y'all remember that 20% cut? Yeah, that 20% cut that RCSD felt as 21%, but many of our suburban districts barely felt at all because they could offset those cuts with property tax revenue. Parts of the body are dying. But guess what? Just like with a stroke, if too much of the body dies, the whole body dies, and we all end up suffering for it. And there are a lot of metrics that we can look at that show that our region is being compromised by its inability to tackle these challenges. Different problem. When we define this problem differently, it requires then a different set of solutions. I would offer to you that Black and Indigenous people of color in this community are not a problem to be solved. I witnessed in far too many conversations where folks paternally talk about how we're going to fix people or how we're going to save people. Indeed, people of color in this community represent an opportunity that we need to realize that by creating more economic parity, economy moves through momentum, that more people participating in innovation, more people participating in the economy actually drives economic growth. That's the solution for many of the challenges that our community is confronting. Therefore, we need to invest in Black and Indigenous people of color communities that have been historically under-resourced. We need solutions that are by the community for the community, because people have the talent, they have the skills, they have the content and the context expertise, but you know what they don't have? The resources, the dollars. And we also recognize that George Eastman, he of scientific governance, that the data has to drive decision-making, also has to realize that data in the wrong hands can do a lot of really terrible things. That perhaps we need to change this model of being so data-driven and then try being community-driven and data-informed. How do we make data consumable, easier for folks to wrestle with, so that they have a voice and they're empowered to make decisions about the direction that the community can go, embracing the traditions of democracy that define our nation state? What we offer to you is a different approach that we consider inclusive recovery for this unique moment. The Urban Institute offered us a report. They looked back over the years and they said, gee, in all of these instances from 1980 on forward, particularly coming out of the 2008 Great Recession, there are some communities that embraced economic and racial inclusion, and there are some that did not. Those that did had stronger recoveries than those that did not. Rochester ranked 241 out of the 274 cities that were measured. I love this community. I know that we can do better than that. Let's leverage this historic moment. Why is this moment historic? Because it's similar to the Great Depression, when interest rates had nearly bottomed out and the only answer was Keynesian economics, meaning that we needed to get more dollars into the real economy. Our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has already signaled that the plan at the federal level is to leverage these historically low interest rates, borrow more, and inject more money into the real economy. But do we put money into the real economy in a way that continues to lead to the extraction of dollars from the city? Are we just going to subsidize more folks from the suburbs to come in and fix people of color? Or do we drive a more proportional share of those actual dollars? I'm talking about the dollars that fix houses and send kids to college, the dollars that allow for people to enjoy a good quality of life, the dollars that help folks not have to go through the kind of economic distress that we know then creates a whole series of other challenges, not just for them, but for all of us. By the way, if you look at the county budget, 76% of it goes towards social services. 76% of it goes towards policing and incarceration through the sheriff's department and the district attorney's office, and goes to health. All remediations of inequity that we could have solved on the front end. Let's try inclusive recovery instead. Let's make sure that when the dollars come from the federal government, that they go in a different way than what we have seen in the past. Let's talk, more action. This doesn't have to be this long discussion. This is a quick moment. The dollars are going to flow quickly. Let's get out ahead of it. Let's make a plan for how the dollars are going to drive equity in this community. Let's think about policy and programming where necessary and change this dynamic where every solution needs a new program. Folks, we can do something differently. And let's again ensure that the jobs and the dollars go to Black, Indigenous people of color. If you're like me and you are tired of opening the newspaper and seeing the same stuff every day, if you feel deep down in your bones that we can do this differently in Rochester, then I'm just asking that you raise your voice, that you take action. The Community Foundation, we're going to be lifting up inclusive recovery. Join that movement. Let's say that we can do this differently. We can take those dollars that we're driving for police. Our police department is one of the largest and most overfunded in the country. Let's take some of that and drive it back into the solutions for our community. We don't even have to defund, although we should consider it. We can just right size the police department and get some headway. My friends, are things that we can do. We can take action. And I encourage you to raise your voice and join us in doing so. And with that, I thank you. Please, please, please help us continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Simeon and Shane. This has just been unbelievable. I want to just come on quickly. I'll tell you, I'm Karen Elam. I'm director of the Levine Center to End Hate. And we have been thrilled to partner with TEDx Rochester on this event this evening. I'm simply here to tell you that we have a Q&A section available if you stay on. If you would like to stay on after this, we are wrapping this up at 6 o'clock. We are going to have half an hour of Q&A that I will help moderate. We've been getting a lot of questions in the Q&A box, so I will be posing those questions to Simeon and Shane. And in the meantime, I just wanted to also mention over 1,600 registered for this program this evening. It's amazing to me. We had a little less than half actually attend, but I am excited because everybody will get this recording, including people that weren't able to come this evening. So we are going to ask everybody to share it as widely as possible as well. And with that, I would like to hand it back over to the co-chair of the Levine Center to End Hate Steering Committee, Kevin Beckford. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And on behalf of the steering committee of the Levine Center to End Hate, I extend heartfelt thanks to Simeon and Shane for an incredible transformative presentation today. Thank you. Also would like to thank you all for joining us this evening, particularly for those of you who will be watching this after we've recorded and posted the broadcast. Thank you for not just watching, but we encourage you to look at things that you can do, as Simeon suggested, to create meaningful change in our community. We are so grateful to the William and Mildred Levine Foundation and Foundation President Todd Levine for their generous support of this wonderful program. You'll also find more information about upcoming programs from the Levine Center to End Hate, as well as many other partner organizations that we work with on our website. And that website is endhaterock.org. That's ENDHATEROC.org. We also are on Facebook. Please be sure to complete the survey that'll pop up when you leave the Zoom today. Your feedback is extremely important to us and will help us to develop future programs to meet the needs of our community. And now over to you, Kwasi.
Thank you all for your stamina and staying with us in this presentation. This was a wonderful way to bring and partner with the Levine Center, with the Jewish Federation. TEDx Rochester is always bringing opportunities to the community with ideas that are worth sharing and really considering what are the next steps, what are the next action items that we can do moving forward. So if you have the bandwidth, I would encourage you to stay on between 6 and 6:30, and you can continue with Shane and Simeon and diving a little deeper into the context and also a lot of the solution-focused ways that we can move the needle. Oftentimes we talk about, what's the ideas we're sharing. There's also action items and what are you going to do with the information that you've taken away. So TEDx Rochester partners with the community. Our passion is with the city of Rochester, and I'm pleased and excited for all of you to continue the conversation and move things forward. And I'm going to turn things over to Shane and to Simeon to keep the conversation going. You'll find the questions that will kind of come up. So if you're going to stick around, stick around. There's a tradition, West African tradition, that we say that when we walk with people, we put our hands on our hearts with them. We have walked with Simeon and Shane this evening. Put your hand on your heart for them and walk with them as we walk forward in this collaborative and continuous conversation of care for our community.
We're back. All right. Thank you so much. And as we mentioned, if you have the time and would like to stay on for this next half hour, please do. We have, as I said, a lot of great questions that we can pose to both Simeon and Shane. And again, thank you both so much for your incredible presentations. We're thrilled. So I want to start with one question, which is, and this could be, I think I'm supposed to know which one of you to pose it to, but I'm going to just pose it. I think this is actually for Shane. My family grew up on Joseph Avenue and ran into discrimination. How is it different for African Americans?
I think when it came to Jewish folks, Italians, Polish people, oftentimes like Joseph Avenue and that Clarissa Street area were places that they were also segregated to through redlining policies and racial covenants and steering through real estate agents and banks in Rochester. But like I said in the presentation, in 1944, that really began to significantly change with the GI Bill, giving people access to full citizenship by changing their racial designation to Jewish folks in our country officially being white. And if you served in World War II, you had that access to home ownership through the VA, and being able to get a loan to buy a house with no money down was something that Jewish folks in our community had access to, and access to the FHA loans, whereas people of color did not have that same access until the late 1960s. So while the discrimination that Jewish folks faced, especially in neighborhoods like Joseph Avenue, there's no way that that didn't happen and that it wasn't bad. It's just that after 1944, things really started to open up, and access for Jewish folks really began to increase, whereas people of color did not have that same access, as you saw in this presentation. So you've got 20, almost 30 years of this head start when it comes to moving forward in our community that people of color didn't have.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, Shane. I mean, a lot of folks have to, have the national context here. Kind of pre-1930, if you were a white ethnic in this country, you were in a fairly disparaged position. I mean, there was a political party that sprung up, the Know Nothing Party, whose policy platform was that Irish folks were essentially rapists, murderers, and coming to steal our jobs. Does that sound familiar? We know that a wonderful article in the New York Times I would refer folks to that was put out on First Peoples Day this past year, with some know as Columbus Day, that asked the question how Italians became white. What folks may not know is that the Italian community was largely disparaged. In New Orleans, around the turn of the century, really fascinating story about this group of Italian folks who were lynched. They were falsely accused of murdering a very popular police chief. And interestingly, in that accusation, it was the first time that some of the derogatory usage of the word mafia really found its way into the American lexicon. So fast forward, there are a couple of things that happen, right? Without going way into the weeds, suffice it to say that Benjamin Harrison, who's president, decided that he wanted to make a bid because he was going to be facing Grover Cleveland again, who was a very popular Democrat, and Benjamin Harrison wanted to win. And so he thought that he could make inroads with white ethnics, and he proposed as a way to do that the first Columbus Day. And in so doing, initiated the process of the whitening, the enlargement of whiteness that Dr. Painter describes. And here in Rochester, that was the case, that by 1911 in Rochester, we started to see annual Columbus Day festivals here. And there was a periodical here in Rochester that was devoted to telling the tales of the Italian contributions in both World War I, when Italians fought for the Italian government, and in World War II, when they actually fought against the Italian government, which of course was part of the Axis nations. That was a watershed moment. But the difference is Tom Bannister, my grandpa, didn't get that same access. He didn't get to come back to those opportunities. And that's the big deal. I mean, it just can't be understated how the echo effect of those decisions continue to plague us today.
Right.
Can I say one other quick thing? Because I did notice in the Q&A, David Zarkowski pointed out, he said Jewish brothers and sisters had a quota on how many could be admitted to the UR medical school until at least the 1970s. True. And then also I would point out that Italian and Irish folks, one of the reasons why we have St. John Fisher and we have Nazareth was as a reaction to being barred from access to University of Rochester. But I would also say that we're not going to get into the Olympics of who endured more oppression, right? Like that's not a particularly constructive thing to do. The real goal is how do we eliminate it altogether so that we have greater economic parity, and in so doing create more opportunity for vibrancy.
Right. Right. Thank you, Simeon. I want to take off on what you just said too. I think the oppression Olympics doesn't benefit anybody. I also think I want to make sure just to mention that that Jewish people are not only white people. There are Jews of color. Absolutely. And I think that within our own white Jewish community, we are beginning to learn more and understand more and address the exclusion oftentimes of Black and brown Jewish people. So I just want to make sure that that's out there because I think we often think of a Jewish person as looking only like me when a Jewish person can look like you too, Simeon. So the next question, thank you, is, and by the way, this is for a separate conversation. I think white privilege is obviously what eventually we have to be also very aware of and very much talking about, but not for tonight. So here's another question. What can we do to remedy the impact and effects of redlining? Either one.
You want to take first crack, Shane? Or you want me to take first crack?
Sure, I'll take the first crack.
Sure.
I think the first thing we have to do is tell the truth about what happened in our community. I gave you about 20 minutes of that history tonight. I could talk for 3 hours. We've developed curriculum at the Pastone Foundation's Anti-Racist Curriculum Project so that school districts, every school district in our county can do an inquiry-based model to look at these primary sources, examine these redlining maps, look at the streets and neighborhoods in their towns that were 100% exclusively white neighborhoods. They can learn about what happened in their schools. I wish I had known that my school in Webster, Plank North, had an annual blackface show. They did. I never learned about that. Instead, I just learned civil rights happened in the South, racism happened in the South, Abraham Lincoln ended slavery, Martin Luther King gave a speech, and Lyndon Johnson signed the law, instead of, oh, actually, hundreds and thousands of people of color fought for racial justice right here in Rochester and are still fighting for that racial justice today, protesting in the streets and the boardrooms and across our community. And I think acknowledging that and telling that truth is going to be key. In our community, I feel like we're oftentimes allergic to telling that truth. It makes me think about Brian Stevenson, the book Just Mercy, the movie came out about him recently. He always talks about how we don't tell the truth in this country. But in countries like Germany that actually give reparations for Holocaust survivors, there is a monument to the Holocaust everywhere you go in Germany. And yet I can't imagine how many of you in this room, I know it's true, a majority are surprised or shocked by some of the stats and statistics that I showed you, or the neighborhoods in this community, because we have never talked about it. And yet how many people are still alive that went to these blackface shows, that participated in this and continue to be complicit in our lack of action and our inaction in this? I'd identify myself as someone who is a racist for most of my life. I would have said I was not racist, which according to Ibram Kendi, that idea, it doesn't really exist to be not racist. You're either actively fighting against racism, or you're allowing it to happen with your complicitness, like I've done for most of my life, or actively creating these policies. In our community, I think too many of us are complicit in allowing this racial injustice and disparity to happen. And if we can't have the hope and the collective imagination to come together and solve these problems, like Simeon began to address at the end of his presentation, I think we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. So I think that's the starting point. I'll let Simeon talk a little more about some of the policy, aside from that education side.
Yeah, interestingly, there's a religious tradition. I'm a Reformed seminarian. There's a religious tradition in this country, the deist tradition. Many of the founding fathers, again, paternalistically, were deists, and that tradition depended on a kind of a metaphorical understanding of God as the cosmic watchmaker, who would kind of make this watch, wind the watch, and then allow human history to kind of play itself out. And once the mechanism was in place, then there was no need to kind of intervene or interrupt. And that's an interesting metaphor when we think about these challenges, because there have been some clear watch winding moments, right? This coming out of the 1930s, boy, was that a watch winding moment or what? Massive expenditures. I mean, huge for the time expenditures of dollars. The Works Progress Administration might be familiar to folks. We, of course, talked about the GI Bill. We, of course, talked about the extension of mortgages and mortgage securities. What all of that does is it winds the watch so that you don't even have to do all that much to continue the same patterns of racial inequity. And we know that there have been things that have been done. And so the question for us is, how do we break that mechanism? How do we disrupt that watch? Because the challenge is that if we only respond with racially benign policy prescriptions, they only reinforce the same disparities because the damage has already been done. So that means that even in policy, it's not enough to be not racist. You gotta be anti-racist. I'm a little nervous. I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed, that our Raise Commission, that others are gonna take this tact, that they're gonna start thinking through how we distribute dollars and resources in ways that are anti-racist. And one of the things that we've been talking with folks about is the notion of things like a tax on non-resident income, like the federal government does, like the state of New York does. Basically says if you come into the state of New York and you earn an income, that you gotta take those dollars that you earned and leave a portion of it behind for what you consumed. We got a lot of folks that are coming into the city of Rochester and earning an income. Maybe we take a little portion of that and reinvest it back into the communities because of the historic harm that has been done that needs to be repaired. And so that's at least one policy prescription. Other folks are talking about residency requirements. There's a lot of different ways that we can start to get at this. The one thing I will say is there is an urgency. That was the point of that presentation, inclusive recovery. There are massive amounts of dollars. $1.9 trillion stimulus bill being marked up as we speak tonight. How's that going to work in Rochester? If we lean into it and we make sure that it's more equitable, we can start to close these disparities and transform this community.
Great, thank you. So how is the segregation endemic to Rochester different than that of other cities like Chicago, where Highway 94 was built to segregate? And it's a two-part question. Why has the segregation in Rochester affected literacy and economic disparity more so than other cities?
I'll start with this one. I think it's really important. When Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, came to town, Simeon and I were at a lunch with him beforehand. We were both on that panel. And he talked about how every city he goes to wants to try to say that they're the most, they have the biggest child poverty, the most racial segregation. But he says every single one of these cities that has these red line neighborhoods, that we're just comparing fractions of still incredible poverty and incredible racial disparity. The point isn't to argue about which is worse. Rochester's definitely near the top, but that's not what's important. I think what's really important is that we have done this collectively as a community. Our government has been done this. And to me, this is part of the reason why reparation and a Marshall Plan to solve these problems has to be a part of this solution.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, the massive amount of resources, that were expended across the country. I mean, you see the same pattern. I could tell you about, Durham Freeway, 147 that runs right through the Hayti neighborhood. That was a historic African-American neighborhood there in Pittsburgh. We know that in the 1930s, same story. In Syracuse, I-81 cuts right through in Buffalo. I mean, just in city after city. So at some point you have to start wondering, is this just a random occurrence or was this maybe something that was more planned? Check this out. Robert Moses, he of Parkway building fame, who was a denizen of our fair state, who built parkways all across this state, drove those parkways through urban neighborhoods. One of his acolytes ultimately ended up going along with FDR to the White House. Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace is somebody that is really kind of hailed in some circles as a liberal icon. That guy who people felt if he had been FDR's successor would have brought on socialized medicine and fundamentally transformed this country. Like that guy said, you know what we can do is we can use urban highways to clean up the fetid and unsanitary conditions around urban centers. And that's a euphemism for get the Black people out, just in case you wondered. And so we do see that same pattern, city after city after city after city. There are some things that make Rochester particularly acute, namely that I would argue that the job base in Rochester at that time was different. So when you look at other cities that are comparable to us, because they had a stronger manufacturing and blue collar base, and this city was kind of more white collar, if you will, again, comparable to Silicon Valley. I think that that's one of the reasons why we see the nature of these challenges so pronounced here in Rochester. And then we were also the tip of the spear. Shouldn't be lost on anybody that the 1964 uprising happened 4 years before the hot summers of '68, right? We were actually the first in the country. And so that suggests to me that some of the compression and some of the frustration and angst that exploded out on that summer night were a species different even than some of the other places that we would be compared to.
I think a key factor of that too, to add on to it, I hope people remember when I showed that part of the FHA underwriting manual that said highways should be constructed to separate inharmonious racial groups. I mean, or to remove them. I mean, FIGHT referred to urban renewal as Black folk removal at a period of time. Howard Coles was actively fighting back against these things with the Voice newspaper. And neighborhoods like Savannah Street, where Strong Museum is today, that was a Black neighborhood, a mixed neighborhood. And those people were all forced out of their homes. Places like Clarissa Street were decimated. I encourage people to check out the amazing documentary that I helped make with Teen Empowerment this past summer, and interviews with elders talking about the Black-owned businesses, the Black Broadway, Shep's Paradise, the Pithod Club. I mean, in spite of all the racial segregation and inequality that was happening in our community, people of color came together and built a beautiful community in some of these neighborhoods. And then urban renewal came through, people like Bob Moses and people in Rochester following his example, and they decimated those places. I mean, the Black-owned grocery store in that neighborhood by Jesse Stevens, that thing got knocked down. There's no Black-owned grocery store in Rochester, right? But then you look at Walter Wegman, here's a guy who had a racial covenant on his house, he could use his home to help invest in his grocery stores. And we've got one Wegmans in Rochester in a Green Line neighborhood. And so thinking about the way we share our resources, who's been given them, and how that impact from the past impacts today, I think is critical. But I don't think that that story is any different from communities across our country. Although, of course, there's unique factors like Simeon's talking about, for sure. But I think looking at it, we're not necessarily special. We just have to be a part of this change at a federal, state, and local level.
Absolutely. And we need our local representatives at the federal level to be articulating these concerns and mobilizing and working alongside other federal officials from other communities, because we do have a lot of shared interests. I want to show you guys one other quick thing, if it's all right. I think I can still share my screen. So I'll show you something really cool. A great grand uncle, actually, who this book of Our Family Mementos. And my great-great-grandfather was very active in the Democratic Party. My family, on my mother's side, comes from Oklahoma. This was a pamphlet that was issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's campaign in 1932. This one went to the Oklahoma Colored Democratic Association, as you can see. And of course, it was titled 1,000 Reasons Why Negroes Should Vote for the Re-Election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I want to point you to just the one that he points out here on housing. Just look at that really quick. The government has expended more than $100 million in clearing up slums in large urban centers and erecting clean, wholesome buildings for Negro occupancy. He references the Ida B. Wells housing project. And look at this, all these cities all across the country. Of course, we know that the Ida B. Wells housing project is indeed that, the projects. And in fact, it was condemned and shut down some years ago. We see the same pattern here in Rochester, of course. Listen, we have to make a distinction between intent and outcomes. They sent this pamphlet out as a good thing, like vote for us, cheer for us because we did this great thing. But we know that ultimately the outcomes have created the same kinds of inequity. So at some point, we got to wrestle with that. I'm looking, for example, at this vaccine distribution. I'm going to raise it again. Don't tell me about the intent. I know we're going to do equity and we're going to make sure that, but when do we actually make sure that the needle that goes in the arm is of that in a way that's proportionate with those that we know have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic? I see my friend Richard Glazer put in the chat here, let's start this month and get BIPOC jabbed with the vaccine. I tend to agree with that sentiment. And there's a number of other areas that we need to be thinking about this in the same approach. Again, because all of us have a vested interest. And this is the point I really want to drive home to folks. Because some people might say, well, but it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much pie to go around. That is not true. That is not how the economy works. It's not, it just isn't. That's not how productivity, it's not how innovation works. What we really want to do is leverage more people with their hands at the plow, starting to solve some of these very real challenges that we have to deal with, is the way that we start to achieve higher levels of growth. I would argue to you that in many ways, what we saw at Kodak maybe too much homogeneity, maybe too many people saying the same thing, looking at the same thing, coming from the same background, and do things like miss the digital revolution. Got big challenges we have to confront, like dealing with this environment. It's another area that the Community Foundation is going to be working on in the very near future. And we need more people, more minds, all those kids. I look at that little 9-year-old girl that got pepper sprayed, and I wonder what an alternate future could have looked like for her, what her contribution could have been. So we've got to do this smarter, and we've got to do it differently, and we've all got a vested interest in doing so.
This makes me think about growing up in Webster, where I never had a Black teacher. I think I sat by 2 students of color, maybe my senior year of high school, right? And thinking about the incredible lack of diversity and how much I missed out on when it came to creativity, seeing things from different perspectives, the ability to solve problems. To think of the person I could have been had I had that kind of diversity in my upbringing. And then I look at the zoning in towns like Webster and Penfield and Fairport, where right now exclusionary zoning is perfectly legal, and in all of our towns, discriminating based on class through lot sizes and preventing any kind of affordable housing or apartments to be built in our suburban communities. And I think about how white people got affordable housing back in the 30s and 40s with the Seth Green apartments, Ramona, Fernwood Village, Norton Village. And Black people like Howard Coles were all denied when they tried to live there. And then today, people of color, we have almost a shortage of 28,000 units of affordable housing. We have almost 9,000 evictions a year in our community. And yet our suburbs, when you look at those maps for the way wealth is hoarded there, and there's absolutely legally no access for affordable housing, those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to come together to start to look at. Not just that, but multiple areas, from the vaccines to health equity to healthcare being a human right. There's so many pieces, but we're also going to have hope that this can happen.
Right. So I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to pose, we have 7 minutes, and I'm going to pose one more question, even though we have a lot of incredible questions in the box. And I do want to mention that several people have asked, will we be sending this recording out? Yes, we will. And I will also connect with Shane and Simeon to see if there are resources that we can recommend. Somebody asked about books, movies. We can point you to some places on our website, but I also know the Clarissa Street documentary would be a fantastic resource to share or point people to. So I will commit to getting that kind of information back out to everybody as well. Let me ask this question, and I'm going to keep us to the time. Are there transitional justice efforts already in motion in Rochester, or other good faith reparative policy efforts?
Shane, I want you to talk about the education work you're doing, if you don't mind.
I will. So I'm the co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. We have a team of predominantly African-American teachers who've collaborated to write and develop curriculum that tells this story in an inquiry-based approach, looking at primary sources, partnered with PERI to use restorative practices and community circles to teach kids how to have these conversations, and then connect them with people of color who today are continuing to do this good social justice work in our community, and empowering those students to look at the legacy of leaders like Howard Coles and Connie Mitchell and Alice Young, to learn about them, to marinate and soak in their stories, be inspired by them, to see themselves in them so that they can make that change. One example that's really been powerful for me and why I do this work is that maybe 4 years ago, I was working with my fourth graders, teaching this curriculum with them, telling them this story. And afterwards, one of my students of color came up to me and said, there's no Black teachers in Henrietta. I'm never going to have a teacher that looks like me. That's racist policy. That's a racist policy. And I was like, you're absolutely right. And she's like, we got to do something about it. So we did what Howard Coles did. We got friends together. We researched it every day at lunch. They met with the principal. They hit him hard with the facts and their demands that we increase the hiring and change what we were doing in the district. They met with the assistant superintendent. Their info went to the school board and superintendents. And today we've established in Henrietta, thanks to the leadership of our schools, we've got 3 historically Black colleges that we're working on a feeder pattern with. We're bending over backwards to be creative so that those girls have a teacher that looks like them, that they truly deserve. If you have 1 Black teacher, the girls found, your chance of graduation goes up by 30% if you're a student of color. And I'll tell you what, when a 9-year-old girl looks at you in the face and says, don't you want me to have a better chance of graduating? You can't back down from that. And imagine what a group of 8th graders and 11th and 12th graders could do if they saw themselves in their history, and if their teachers had a chance to go through the same inquiry. We do a 3-hour professional development. It's free for any school district in the county. We're in 10 different school districts right now and have trained almost 900 teachers in learning this story, doing the same inquiry in restorative circles with kids, owning the ways that they've been complicit in racism, and empowering them to be anti-racist, both in their teaching and in their community. And we hope that that's one of the ways that we can start to change the conversation in our community, which is why I'm so grateful to the Levine Center for hosting this event tonight, and me and Simeon to be able to carry on this conversation, which I hope all of you in this room will answer the same question that we ask every teacher at the end of our PD, is this question of how have you been impacted or benefited from racism? And I know I have been negatively and positively impacted because of racism and complicit in allowing it to happen. And I say that we have to look at that first so that then we can start to take those action steps, learn from our mistakes, keep trying, learn and grow and follow people of color who are doing this work in our community, and keep pushing for systemic change at each of those levels of government, in our organizations that we attend, and keep telling the truth about what happened and how we can move forward.
I'll tell you guys something funny. So my that great grandfather that I mentioned, I was looking at some of our old family records, and there's a line that he was a farmer, but he would go north during the winter to earn his income. And I was always confused by that line until I learned that he was actually a bootlegger. So some people's grandparents can be bootlegger and you become president of the United States. Other people, that works a little differently, of course, talking about John F. Kennedy. But that farming reference, you don't have to be a farmer to know that if we go outside right now on one of these cold Rochester days with a packet of seeds and you sprinkle those seeds on the ground, that they won't grow. It's not like you can expect that in the spring you'll all of a sudden have all this new fruit, because that ground has to be warmed and it's got to be tilled. What we're doing tonight is tilling the ground. When you ask, what are the things in Rochester that are already underway that are transitional in nature? I wonder if we have sprinkled some seeds without doing the work of tilling the ground. We funded at the Community Foundation Shane's project because we know that that's ground tilling work, that we need young folks that are going to, and a whole new generation of folks that are going to come to the work with a different presentation. They're going to come into this community with a different understanding of the challenges that we have been through and that we need to confront now. And so we are doing more of this, talking to folks, engaging with folks to try to turn that ground over so that we can plant these seeds. And what are the seeds that we have to plant? Well, we know that we have to impact the economy. Because when we go back and we look at the history, isn't that where we see so many of these challenges present themselves? So just doing all the programmatic stuff and expecting that somehow, you know, if people just get an education, that they'll be fine. Well, you get an education, but then you can't find a job. How does that work, right? And I would also offer to you that one of the other things I would like for folks to walk away with is to rethink how we value jobs in this community. What do I mean by that? Well, to be a teacher here in Rochester, you got to have a master's degree. Shane will confirm. Unless you want to substitute teach, in which case then you still got to get a little certification, but you got to get a master's degree. Now, I know a lot of people that have master's degrees, many of our teachers do, but when I look at the results for Rochester City School District, I wonder if the master's degree is the equivalent of being a good teacher. I wonder if instead that credential maybe is just a barrier, because in a lot of classes that I visited, I've watched some of those paraprofessionals, and those paraprofessionals seem to be relating to these kids. They seem to be able to connect. They seem to be the folks that are responsible for keeping calm in the class as a prerequisite for then learning. And I wonder why they are being paid a third to half of what the teacher is being paid. I wonder if when it came time to have the conversation about layoffs, it was them and Bente that were the first off, and now we have to figure out how to even get kids a good hot lunch. Think about that for a second, about what we value and about what matters and about who matters. And a lot of the organizations that I find myself engaged with, nonprofit organizations, who tell me we would hire people if we could, but we just can't find them. I start to say, gee, are we looking? Are we thinking about value? Hey, is it because someone's not the right fit because their hair's a little different? Is it not the right fit because they don't express the same cultural mores? I wonder if we need to change as institutions and organizations, if we need to be more thoughtful about value. I think in doing that, we can start remedy some of these challenges. We've got to deal with that hiring bias. We've got to get more people involved in the economy. And the last thing I say, promise Karen, because I know we're at 6:30, is that we have got to make sure that in this new innovative economy, great book, Jumpstarting America, says that Rochester is positioned to be one of the most robust economies in this technological revolution that we're going through. Rochester could be it, but guess what? It ain't gonna work if 30% of the people are sitting on the economic sideline. We gotta make sure that when you walk through NextCorp, that when you go to RIT, when you walk through the Laser Center at University of Rochester, that we're starting to see more people that look a little different that are participating in that innovation and subsequently benefiting from it. If we can do that, I think that we've got the seeds that are starting to be planted so that we can see real growth.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. This was incredible. I've been watching comments, chats pop up, and I think that people have a lot of work to do, but there's so much that you shared with us. We are truly at a tipping point, and I think as a community, we need to really till and plant and do the work that you're talking about, Simeon and Shane. I have to tell you that I can only imagine what an incredible teacher you are. So I thank you both from the bottom of my heart. I want to take again a moment to thank the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester, to thank our steering committee, to thank the William and Mildred Levine Foundation for supporting this effort, and to thank TEDx Rochester for doing this with us. We are so excited, and there is so much to be done. We'll be getting back in touch with everybody. And again, thank you, and everyone take good care. Have a good night.